Ever feel like you're kind of echoing the past? Not literally, of course, but like, what if your grandparents' experiences, their actual experiences, could be impacting you today? Your health even. It's wild. That's epigenetics, and that's what we're diving into today.
It really makes you think beyond just nature versus nurture, like how much is just our genes. Epigenetics shows us how much experiences might actually ripple through generations. It's pretty amazing.
Right. It really is. And we've got some groundbreaking research to dig into today. It's from Dr. Bianca Jones-Marlin's lab over at Columbia University. They're doing some really fascinating work with, well, they use what they call model organisms. Mice, actually.
Yeah, mice are really, well, they're perfect for this kind of research, you see. They reproduce really quickly, which lets the scientists study generational effects in a much shorter time frame than humans, obviously. And also, their genetics and their brain structure, they have enough in common with us humans to make the findings relevant. We can actually learn something about ourselves from these mice studies.
Okay, so before we jump headfirst into Dr. Marlin's research, can we do a super quick recap of what epigenetics actually is for anyone who might not be familiar, or just to refresh our memories?
Well, absolutely. Think of it this way. Your DNA, it's basically a giant recipe book, right? It's got all the instructions for, well, building you, running your body, all of it. And epigenetics, those are like sticky notes on those recipes. They don't actually change the recipes themselves. They just tell the cell which ones to read, when to read them, and even how often.
So it's like these sticky notes can say, okay, make more of this protein right now, or even skip this instruction for a bit.
Exactly. And what's so amazing is that these epigenetic notes, they can be influenced, like directly influenced by our environment, by our experiences. That's what's so groundbreaking.
And get this, those notes, they can be passed down to our kids.
That's the million-dollar question. And Dr. Marlin's research really seems to indicate that, yeah, it's possible. One of the experiments, it focused on mice and their sense of smell. And it's pretty mind-blowing. We should definitely dive into that.
Okay, yeah, let's do it. What did they do in this experiment with the mice and the smells?
So they exposed these mice to a very specific smell. Acetophenone, it's called. It's a chemical. And it has this slightly sweet, almost almond-like scent.
Okay, I'm with you. Keep going.
And at the same time, at the exact same time the mice smelled this acetophenone, they also gave them this very, very mild electric shock to their foot.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I can only imagine that would, create a pretty strong association in their little mouse brains, the smell and the not so pleasant sensation.
Yeah, exactly. So completely unsurprisingly, the mice, they learned to fear that almond smell really quickly. But here's where it gets really, really interesting. Their brains didn't just, learn to fear the smell. They actually changed physically.
Well, hold on. What do you mean changed?
The mice literally grew more neurons, brain cells, but specifically designed to detect acetophenone, which made them extra sensitive to it. It's like their brains rewired themselves based on this one experience.
Wow. So this one experience, it had a real, measurable impact on their brains, their physical brains.
And it doesn't even stop there. The most amazing part is that this heightened sensitivity to the smell, along with those extra neurons, it was passed down to their offspring, to their babies. And these offspring, they'd never experienced the electric shock themselves.
Hold on, wait. So even though the baby mice weren't there for the traumatic experience, they still inherited the fear response. Mm-hmm. That's wild. What does Dr. Marlin say about that?
She calls it transgenerational epigenetic inheritance. Basically, it seems like the trauma, the fear of the smell paired with the shock, it was passed down through generations. And while this specific experiment, it focused on mice, Dr. Marlin thinks that similar processes could be happening in humans too, which is, it's a lot to think about.
Yeah, it really is. And there's actually, historical evidence to support this, right? I'm thinking of the Dutch hunger winter.
Oh, right, yeah. During World War II in the Netherlands, they had that terrible famine. And years later, researchers found that the children and even the grandchildren of the women who were pregnant during the famine, they had a much higher risk for certain health issues, like way higher rates of diabetes, obesity, even some more serious things like schizophrenia.
So it's like the trauma, the literal trauma of that famine, it echoed down generations later.
Wow, it makes you wonder what other kinds of experiences could leave this kind of legacy,
In Dr. Marlin, she talks about how man-made traumas, like war or even systemic racism, these could also have a lasting intergenerational impact. It really makes you think about how we even begin to address these disparities. Because if the effects of trauma can be, woven into our biology, How do we create solutions that are actually effective? It's a huge question. It really is. That's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, I'm kind of stuck on how this is even possible in the first place. Like, if the offspring, if the babies weren't physically there for that initial trauma, how is that information being transmitted? What's the mechanism here?
That's where things get really, really interesting. Dr. Marlin's research, it seems to point to sperm. Sperm might actually be a really key part of all of this.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. What's so special about sperm in all of this?
Well, it's like this. Unlike eggs, which are present in females from birth, sperm, they're always being produced, right? Throughout a male's entire life. And this means that they're actually much more susceptible to changes based on the environment or even the guy's life experiences, all sorts of things.
So you're saying they're what, constantly adapting?
Yeah.
Evolving even?
Yeah.
Based on whatever the male is going through?
Exactly. It's like a much more dynamic process than we thought. And remember those epigenetic markers we were talking about before, the sticky notes? Well, it seems like sperm, they carry more than just the basic genetic code. They've got this whole extra layer of information that Dr. Marlin, she actually calls it an epidosomal payload.
An epidosomal payload. Wow. Okay, that sounds pretty complex, to say the least.
It's definitely complex, but we can think of it, in simpler terms. It's like an extra set of, instructions. But these instructions, they can be influenced by, anything in the father's life, really. Diet, stress, if he's exposed to toxins, even things like drug use, it can all have an impact.
So it's not even just our genes that we're passing down, but it could be like echoes of our actual experiences as well. I mean, that's pretty profound when you really stop and think about it.
Oh, absolutely. It really challenges the way we've always thought about inheritance, Like, what does it even mean to inherit something? And there's this other study that Dr. Marlin mentions, and it looked at the effects of cocaine use in men. And they actually found that using cocaine led to some very specific changes in the sperm's epigenome. So again, it really suggests that these changes, these epigenetic changes, they could be passed down to future generations. It's amazing.
Okay, yeah. Wow. This is a lot to process. And it makes you think about, the big picture implications for things like, even free will or how much is even our own fault. Because if our ancestors' experiences are literally, shaping our brains and bodies without us even knowing it, does that mean that we're less in control of our destinies than we thought,
That's a big one, right? It's like the ultimate question. Philosophers, scientists, we've all been wrestling with that one forever. But Dr. Marlin, she has this really interesting perspective on it, and I think it might surprise some people.
Okay, well, I'm all ears. What's her take?
Well, she's very, very clear that, understanding these mechanisms, understanding how this inheritance works, it's not about placing blame, right? It's not about saying, oh, well, you have anxiety because your great-grandmother went through a terrible trauma, so it's, not your fault. It's not about that at all. It's more about recognizing the connection, the really powerful connection between generations and realizing that we could be carrying this legacy, and it goes way beyond our own individual experiences. It's much bigger than just us.
Right, yeah. That's a really, really important distinction. So if it's not about blame, then what is it about? If we know all this, what are we supposed to do with that information?
Dr. Marlin, she actually thinks this knowledge, it's empowering. Because if we understand that we might be carrying this baggage from our past, our family's past, even if we don't remember it or even know about it consciously, it can help us make different choices in our lives, better choices.
So instead of it being this limitation, right, on our free will, this knowledge could be a tool for making positive changes. That's a really cool way to look at it.
That's exactly it. It's about taking ownership, but in a whole new way. We can start to break those cycles, the cycles of trauma, and make these positive changes that don't just benefit us, but they go down the line, to impact future generations. It's powerful.
This is really making me rethink, my whole family history and where I fit into all of it. But, okay, here's another thought. What if scientists like Dr. Marlin, they actually figure out how to, turn off the negative effects of this inherited trauma? Should they even do that? I mean, what are the ethics of something like that?
It really is, isn't it? It's almost like science fiction coming to life. And yeah, it brings up so many questions about where do we draw the line? What are we allowed to change?
Right. It's a huge question. Yeah. If we can erase those echoes of trauma, from generations ago, shouldn't we? At least for the sake of those who come after us. But then where does it stop?
Yeah.
What about other traits? Things we inherit that maybe aren't so great? It just seems like it could be a slippery slope.
It really makes you think about consent too, doesn't it? Like those future generations, they don't really get a say in whether we hit the reset button on their inheritance, even if we think it's for the best.
That's so true. It's like, would we even be doing them a favor? What if some of those things, those challenges we inherit, what if they're actually what make us stronger, more resilient, or even just, more understanding, more empathetic? It's like that quote, the wound is a place where the light enters you.
Oh, I love that quote. It's so true. It speaks to how, even those difficult experiences, the painful ones, they can be a source of growth, of, deeper understanding. And it reminds me of what Dr. Marlin was saying, about knowledge being its own kind of power.
Right. It's not about just erasing the past, acting like it never happened. It's about understanding it, learning from it, and then using that knowledge to make a better future for everyone.
Exactly. And honestly, that's where the real magic of Dr. Marlin's work is. It's not even just the science itself. It's the conversations it starts, the questions it makes us all ask about, who we are, and what our place is in this whole grand scheme of things. It's huge.
It really is. A whole new way of thinking about family, about legacy. It's kind of humbling, actually, and amazing all at the same time.
It truly is. And it just it highlights how interconnected we all are, how we're all part of this giant web of experiences that goes back, who knows how far, generations and generations. And it'll keep going long after we're gone. It's pretty incredible.
Well said. Well, as we wrap up our deep dive into this incredible world, the world of epigenetics and inherited trauma, I want to leave you with one final thought. Take a minute, just a minute, to think about your own family's story, their history. What echoes from their past might you be carrying with you? And how can that knowledge, now that you have it, how can it help you make positive changes, not just for yourself, but for everyone who comes after you, your kids, their kids? It's all connected.
Knowledge is power, that's for sure. The more we learn about ourselves, about how our bodies, our minds really work, the better equipped we are to create a better future for ourselves and for all the generations to come.